Welcome, night travelers, to a brutally honest history day. This is the show that drags you through humanity's worst mornings so you can feel better about yours. If that sounds delightful, smash the like button. Now dim the lights, cue a low fan, and brace yourself for the Great Lisbon Catastrophe. The Great Lisbon Catastrophe. A brutally honest day in Portugal. November 1st, 1755. Picture this. It's All Saints' Day morning, and you're packed into a church like a sardine in holy oil, surrounded by enough candles to roast an ox. The incense is thick, the Latin is droning, and you're wondering if God would notice you sneaking out for some fresh air. Then the ground starts doing the samba. Congratulations, you've just won front row seats to one of history's most efficient urban demolition projects, courtesy of Mother Earth's temper tantrum. 5:30 a.m., the calm before the shitstorm. In the pre-dawn darkness of Lisbon, bakers are already sweating over their ovens, preparing the day's bread for a city of 275,000 souls who have no idea they're about to become statistics. The air hangs heavy with November fog, rolling in from the Tagus River, mixing with smoke from thousands of cooking fires. It's All Saints' Day, which means mandatory church attendance for anyone who doesn't want their neighbors whispering about their dubious relationship with the Almighty. Maria da Silva, a fishmonger's wife, is already awake, wrestling her 5 children into their least offensive clothes. Her youngest, João, has managed to smear yesterday's fish scales across his Sunday shirt. She spits on her thumb, that universal maternal cleaning solution, and scrubs at the stain while muttering prayers that sound suspiciously like curses. Down by the docks, longshoremen are unloading crates of Brazilian gold, Indian spices, and African ivory. The Portuguese Empire's wealth flows through these wharves like blood through arteries, and just like arteries, they're about to get spectacularly clogged. The dockworkers joke about their hangovers and argue about whose wife makes the worst codfish stew, blissfully unaware that in about 4 hours they'll be discovering exciting new ways to die. In the royal palace, King José I is probably the only person in Lisbon happy to be awake at this ungodly hour. He's planning to skip town after Mass for a hunting trip, which will make him history's luckiest truant. His ministers are less fortunate, preparing for another day of pretending Portugal's economy isn't held together by Brazilian gold and positive thinking. The Portuguese Empire at this point was essentially an elaborate Ponzi scheme with better weather and more interesting diseases. 6:45 a.m., morning prayers, and bad omens. The churches are starting to fill. São Roque, São Vicente Fora, the Grand Basilica de Santa Maria, architectural marvels that took centuries to build and will take about 40 seconds to demolish. The faithful file in, genuflecting and crossing themselves with muscle memory perfected over lifetimes of Catholic guilt. In the Carmo convent, Sister Beatrice notices the holy water in the font is rippling. She attributes it to Sister Constanza's heavy footfalls. The woman walks like she's perpetually crushing grapes and returns to her prayers. The convent's famous library, containing irreplaceable manuscripts dating back to the 12th century, sits in perfect silence. In 90 minutes, it will contribute to one of history's most expensive bonfires. The city's dogs are acting strange, whining, pulling at their chains, trying to flee toward the hills. The cats have already vanished. Animals, it turns out, have better earthquake prediction systems than 18th century seismologists, who at this point in history believe earthquakes are caused by underground wind flatulence. No, seriously, young Antonio Ferreira, an altar boy at the cathedral, drops the communion wine while preparing for Mass. The elderly priest cuffs him on the ear and grumbles about the declining quality of today's youth. Antonio will be dead in 2 hours, crushed under the same altar he's now carefully wiping clean. The priest will survive, naturally, because God has a sense of humor darker than Portuguese coffee. Did you know? The Lisbon earthquake registered an estimated 8.5-9 on the Richter scale, making it one of the most powerful earthquakes in recorded history. For comparison, that's roughly the same force as 32 billion tons of TNT, or what happens when you give plate tectonics a really good reason to be angry. The quake was felt as far away as Finland and North Africa, presumably confusing the hell out of people who thought they were having a particularly violent bout of vertigo. 7:30 a.m. The last normal hour. Mass is beginning across the city, the air thick with incense and body odor, a uniquely Catholic cologne that somehow makes suffering smell sacred. At the patriarchal church, the sermon is about God's mercy. The cosmic irony meter just exploded. In the Jewish quarter, converted Jews, or new Christians as they're politely called, while everyone winks knowingly, attend Mass with the enthusiasm of people who know the Inquisition is taking attendance. João Rodrigues stands in the back, mechanically mouthing Latin prayers, while mentally calculating how much his latest shipment of cloth will fetch. He's worried about his warehouse near the docks. He should be worried about the docks themselves, which are about to attempt low orbit. The city's 1,000 church bells are ringing, calling the faithful to prayer. It's a cacophony of bronze and iron that drowns out conversation, thought, and apparently the sound of tectonic plates, grinding together like God's own pepper mill. In the narrow streets, late arrivals rush to church, dodging sedan chairs carrying the wealthy and waste buckets being emptied from upper windows with disturbing accuracy. At the Royal Hospital, Dr. Joaquim Tavares is making his rounds, checking on patients suffering from the usual collection of 18th century ailments. Consumption, bad humors, and that catch-all diagnosis, God's will. He notes that several patients seem unusually agitated. One elderly man keeps insisting the floor is moving. Tavares prescribes a bleeding and makes a note to reduce the patient's wine ration. Medical science, ladies and gentlemen. 18th century medicine was essentially weaponized guesswork with a doctorate. 8:50 a.m. The Divine Warm-Up Act. Something's wrong, but nobody can quite put their finger on it. Horses are stamping and whinnying in their stables. The Tagus River seems oddly still, like it's holding its breath. Birds that should be singing morning songs are instead fleeing en masse towards Spain, possibly the only time in history anyone has fled towards Spain for safety. In the Church of São Nicolau, Father Francisco is deep into his homily about the wages of sin. He's really hitting his stride, working up a good theatrical sweat about the torments awaiting the unrighteous when he notices the chandelier swaying. Just a draft, he thinks, and continues describing hell's architectural features with the enthusiasm of a real estate agent working on commission. Manuel Silva, no relation to Maria the fishmonger's wife, Silva is to Portugal what Smith is to England, is sitting in his pew fighting to stay awake. He's a dock worker who loaded cargo until 3 a.m. and is now being told he's probably going to hell for coveting his neighbor's new boots. His wife elbows him sharply as his head starts to nod. In about 10 minutes, staying awake will be the least of his problems. The tremor is so slight most people miss it. A few candles flicker. A saint's statue wobbles imperceptibly on its pedestal. Under the city, tectonic forces that have been building for centuries are about to cash in their chips. The Atlantic Plate and the Eurasian Plate have been arm wrestling for millennia, and someone's about to get their arm broken. 9:40 a.m. God drops the base. The first shock hits like Thor's own hammer. Not a rolling tremor, but a violent vertical thrust that launches people off their knees and into impromptu flight. For a moment, Lisbon's faithful experience the miracle of levitation. Then, gravity reasserts itself with extreme prejudice. The sound is indescribable. Imagine thunder being tortured. Stone grinds against stone, wood splinters, and underneath it all is a bass note so low it's felt rather than heard. It's the planet clearing its throat, and it's about to spit. In São Roque, the congregation has exactly 3 seconds to contemplate whether this is part of the service before the roof introduces itself to the floor. The gilded Baroque ceiling, a masterpiece that took 40 years to complete, completes its final journey to ground level in 40 seconds. Those who aren't immediately crushed start screaming, which is difficult when you're breathing a mixture of ancient dust and pulverized saint. The royal palace splits like a ripe melon. Fortunately, King José is already several miles away, probably wondering why his horse is trying to climb a tree. Less fortunately, his entire administrative staff is inside, about to discover that burial in paperwork isn't always a metaphor. Maria da Silva, our fishmonger's wife, watches in horror as the church wall beside her develops a crack that races upward like black lightning. She grabs 2 of her children and runs for the door, screaming for the others. The door frame collapses just as she reaches it. Her last thought is that she never should have complained about Joao's fish scales. Archaeological evidence suggests that approximately 40% of Lisbon's churches collapsed within the first minute. God, apparently, has terrible aim. 9:45 a.m. The earth keeps dancing. The first shock lasts an eternal 3.5 minutes. When it finally stops, survivors think it's over. They crawl from the rubble, bleeding, coated in dust that makes them look like ghosts of themselves. Then comes the second shock. This one's personal. Buildings that survived the first assault now wave like wheat in a hurricane. The narrow streets become death traps as 5-story buildings fold in on themselves, upper floors pancaking down with a rhythmic boom, boom, boom that sounds like giants' footsteps. The few people who made it outside discover that outside is relative when it's raining architecture. At the waterfront, something bizarre is happening. The tide is going out, way out. The river bottom is exposed for hundreds of yards, revealing centuries of sunken boats, lost cargo, and extremely confused fish. Dock workers, displaying the judgment that made humans the dominant species, walk out onto the exposed riverbed to collect stranded fish and possibly treasure. They're about to learn why the ocean has a return policy. In the ruins of the Carmo convent, Sister Beatrice is somehow still alive, trapped under a beam with her legs crushed. She can see Sister Constanza's hand sticking out from a pile of rubble, still clutching her rosary. Beatrice starts to pray, then stops. What's the point? God clearly isn't taking calls right now. The second shock lasts 2 minutes but feels like 2 hours. More buildings collapse. The castle on the hill sheds walls like a molting snake. The aqueduct, one of the engineering marvels of the age, develops an urgent need to lie down. Everywhere, people are screaming, praying, or doing both. Simultaneously, in a kind of terrified harmony, 10:15 a.m., fire sale, everything must go. As if earthquakes weren't enough, Lisbon now decides to audition for the role of Rome circa 64 AD. Remember all those thousands of candles in the churches? The cooking fires in every home, the forges, the bakeries, the oil lamps? They've all decided to get together for a reunion tour. The fire starts in 100 places at once. In the ruins of homes, overturned braziers ignite broken furniture. Churches become crematoriums as altar candles meet shattered wood and centuries of accumulated incense residue. The wind, because nature is nothing if not thorough, picks up to fan the flames. Survivors face an impossible choice: stay in the open and risk being crushed by aftershocks, or seek shelter and risk being roasted. Most choose option 3, run toward the river. This seems brilliant until they realize the river has apparently decided to take a vacation. Antonio the altar boy, remember him? Didn't die under the altar after all. He's crawling through the ruins of the cathedral, his left arm bent at an angle arms shouldn't bend. He can hear fire crackling nearby, smells smoke mixing with the dust. He finds a gap in the rubble and squeezes through, only to emerge into a street he doesn't recognize because most of the landmarks are now ground level. Did you know? The Lisbon earthquake occurred on All Saints' Day, when every church in the city was packed with worshippers and lit with thousands of candles. This timing led to much theological debate about whether God was making a point, had terrible aim, or just possesses a sense of irony so dark it could be used to line coffins. Voltaire would later use this earthquake to savage the concept of the best of all possible worlds in Candide, essentially writing the 18th century's most devastating Yelp review of divine providence. 10:45 a.m. Tsunami, the ocean's encore. Remember those smart dock workers collecting fish from the exposed riverbed? They're about to discover why the ocean went away. It wanted a running start. The wave appears on the horizon like a moving wall. It's not the towering Hollywood wave most imagine, it's worse. It's a surge, a massive raising of the entire sea level that just keeps coming and coming. The first wave is 17 feet high and moving at the speed of a galloping horse. The dock workers have maybe 30 seconds to contemplate their life choices before the Atlantic Ocean personally introduces itself. The wave doesn't break, it just overwhelms, picking up ships like toys and using them as battering rams against whatever buildings the earthquake missed. João Baptista, a customs official who survived the earthquake by the miracle of being in the outhouse when his office collapsed, watches from a hill as the tsunami arrives. Ships are driven inland like bizarre siege weapons. A 3-masted caravel surfs up the Rua Augusta and parks itself in what used to be a wine merchant's shop. The wave carries away people, horses, carriages, and approximately half of Portugal's GDP. But wait, nature's not done yet? That was just the appetizer. 20 minutes later, here comes wave number 2, this one 26 feet high and apparently trying to win a prize. It surges even further inland, turning streets into rivers and basements into aquariums. The fire and water meet in certain neighborhoods, creating steam clouds that would be fascinating if they weren't full of boiled humans. The third wave, arriving fashionably late, is the biggest. 30 feet of fuck you direct from Neptune's trident. By now, most people near the waterfront are already dead, which is probably merciful because this wave doesn't just flood, it scours. When it retreats, it takes entire neighborhoods with it, leaving behind smooth mud and the occasional bewildered survivor wondering where their city went. The tsunamis traveled up the Tagus River for miles, turning riverside towns into underwater theme parks. Property values, needless to say, took a hit. 12 p.m., intermission in hell. By noon, Lisbon looks like it lost a fight with all 4 horsemen of the apocalypse at once. The earthquake has reduced most buildings to rubble, the tsunami has washed away the waterfront, and the fire is now a conflagration that would make Nero jealous. The survivors are in shock, wandering through unrecognizable streets. Many are naked or nearly so, their clothes torn off by the violence of the quake or stripped away to escape the ruins. Class distinctions have temporarily evaporated. You can't tell a duchess from a fishwife when they're both covered in dust and blood and screaming for their children. In the ruins of a mansion, The Marquis de Almeida sits on what used to be his imported Italian marble steps, watching his life's accumulation burn. His wife is dead, crushed by a statue of the Virgin Mary. The irony is not lost on him. His children are missing. He's one of the richest men in Portugal, and right now he'd trade it all for a cup of water and the knowledge that his sons are alive. The Royal Hospital, which somehow partially survived, is overwhelmed. Dr. Avares, our bleeding enthusiast from this morning, is now performing emergency amputations with a carpenter's saw because his surgical instruments are buried under tons of rubble. The screaming is constant. He's run out of laudanum and is using brandy as both antiseptic and anesthetic. Medical science has devolved to cut off the crushed bits and hope for the best. 2 p.m. The blessed bureaucracy, Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, the future Marquis of Pombal and current Secretary of State, arrives on scene. While everyone else is having a perfectly reasonable mental breakdown, this magnificent bastard starts giving orders like he's been preparing for apocalypses his whole life. "Bury the dead and feed the living," he declares, which becomes history's most efficient mission statement. He immediately bans price gouging on food, punishable by hanging, organizes survivor camps, and starts planning the new city while the old one is still burning. When nobles complain about having to clear rubble alongside commoners, he suggests they can either pick up a shovel or pick out a nice spot on the gallows. India's engineers are sent to survey the damage. Their report essentially reads, "Everything's fucked. Start over." Pombal nods like this is perfectly reasonable and starts sketching grid patterns for streets wide enough that buildings can't fall across them. He's basically playing SimCity while standing in the ashes of the old one. The fire continues to rage. The narrow medieval streets act like chimneys, creating their own weather systems. Firestorms develop that suck in air with hurricane force. Survivors report seeing tornadoes of flame dancing through the ruins like drunk fire elementals. The Biblioteca Real, with its 70,000 volumes, burns for 3 days straight, sending the wisdom of ages up in smoke that probably smells like intellectual barbecue. 5 p.m. Theological discussions at knife point. As darkness approaches, the social order begins to fray like a cheap doublet. Looters emerge from wherever looters hide during normal times, probably a parallel dimension accessed through moral flexibility. They pick through ruins, looking for anything valuable, occasionally having to negotiate with corpses for their jewelry. The surviving clergy are having a theological crisis. If God just dropped his own house on his most faithful servants during a mandatory worship service, what exactly is the message here? Some priests declare it's punishment for sin, though they're vague about which sins specifically. Others suggest it's a test of faith, a test that many people failed by dying. A few progressive thinkers quietly wonder if maybe earthquakes just happen, but they keep this heretical thought to themselves. Meanwhile, the Inquisition, because they're nothing if not consistent, starts looking for someone to blame. Jews? Protestants? That guy who looked at a Bible funny last week? The fact that their headquarters also collapsed and killed most of the inquisitors doesn't slow them down. The survivors just see it as God, helpfully pointing out they weren't inquisiting hard enough. In the ruins of the Jewish quarter, Isaac/João Rodrigues has survived and is quietly helping rescue Christians from collapsed churches. He doesn't mention the irony of this. When a bleeding priest thanks him and asks his name, he gives his Christian name and keeps pulling at the rubble. Some things transcend even the apocalypse. The Inquisition would later blame the earthquake on tolerance of Protestants, which is like blaming a hurricane on insufficient tax collection. Technically possible if you're creative enough with causation. 8 p.m. Night falls on what's left. As darkness settles over Lisbon, the city presents a scene from Dante's Fever Dreams. The fire provides the only light, painting everything in shades of hell. The silhouettes of ruined buildings stand like broken teeth against the orange sky. The air is thick with smoke, dust, and the smell of things that shouldn't be burning but are. Thousands camp in open spaces, terrified to go near any standing structures. The Rocio Square looks like a refugee camp designed by someone who's never seen a refugee camp but has strong opinions about suffering. Families huddle together, sharing whatever food and water they've managed to save. Class distinctions are temporarily suspended. Hunger and terror are great equalizers. The aftershocks continue, each one sending fresh waves of panic through the survivors. Every tremor could be the start of another big one. People pray, but quietly, as if afraid of attracting divine attention. Some have stopped praying altogether, deciding that if God's listening, he's clearly not in a helpful mood. Sister Beatrice, the trapped nun from this morning, finally dies as night falls. She's been under that beam for 10 hours, her legs crushed, slowly bleeding out. Her last words, according to a survivor who heard her, were, "Tell God I want a refund." Theology was simpler before today. 11 p.m. The accounting. By late evening, Pombal's emergency government has established some basic order. Food distribution points are set up. Guards patrol to prevent looting by shooting looters, which is remarkably effective. Engineers work by firelight to clear roads for emergency access. It's organized chaos, which is a significant improvement over the regular chaos of 12 hours ago. The death toll is impossible to calculate accurately. Bodies are everywhere, under rubble, floating in the harbor, burned beyond recognition in the fire zones. Grim. The official count will eventually reach about 60,000, but this is almost certainly low. Entire families vanished, leaving no one to report them missing. Whole neighborhoods were swept out to sea, taking their census data with them. The economic damage is even harder to calculate. Portugal's colonial wealth, gold, spices, silk, went up in smoke or out to sea. The customs house, with its meticulous records of the empire's trade, is now part of the Atlantic Ocean's filing system. Churches full of golden altars and priceless art are now very expensive rubble piles. The country's GDP just experienced what economists would call a significant negative adjustment, if economists existed yet. Did you know? The Lisbon earthquake profoundly influenced the European Enlightenment, essentially giving philosophy an existential crisis. Voltaire wrote Candide specifically to mock the idea that we live in the best of all possible worlds. While Kant was so shaken, he wrote 3 papers trying to explain earthquakes scientifically. The earthquake basically forced Europe to admit that maybe, just maybe, natural disasters weren't personalized divine punishments, but were just physics being physics. This was considered dangerously radical thinking, like suggesting the Earth orbits the sun, or that bleeding people doesn't cure diseases. November 2nd, 3 a.m. The new morning. As All Souls' Day dawns. How's that for cosmic timing? Lisbon is a fundamentally different city, not just physically, though the redesign is comprehensive, but philosophically. The survivors have lived through what their grandparents would have called the wrath of God, and what their grandchildren will call plate tectonics. King Jose, who spent the earthquake hunting and the aftermath living in a tent because he's now pathologically afraid of buildings, issues proclamations from his canvas palace. He gives Pombal unlimited power to rebuild, which Pombal uses to essentially invent modern urban planning and disaster management. Streets will be widened, buildings will be earthquake-resistant, and the clergy will have significantly less say in civic matters. Amazing what a little divine property damage can do for secularization. The firestorm finally begins to die down. Having run out of city to consume, the ruins smoke like the world's largest funeral pyre, which is essentially what they are. In the harbor, bodies wash up with every tide, a grim reminder that the ocean always returns what it borrows, just not in the condition you'd prefer. As the sun rises on November 2nd, Lisbon looks like God's own demolition project. But humans are nothing if not stubbornly persistent. Already survivors are making plans. Merchants calculate what they can salvage. Builders eye the ruins with professional interest. Priests prepare sermons that will somehow explain why God decided to play cosmic Jenga with his own house. Dr. Tavares, who hasn't slept in 24 hours and is now operating on a combination of professional duty and whatever that brandy was, makes his final rounds. He saved maybe 30 people and lost 300. His surgical tools are stolen cutlery, his operating table is a door, and his medical knowledge is about as useful as a chocolate teapot. But he keeps working because that's what humans do. We persist, stupidly and gloriously, in the face of evidence that we shouldn't. And in the ruins of the cathedral, where yesterday morning young Antonio dropped the communion wine, a small fire still burns in what was the altar. It's been burning for 18 hours, feeding on wooden saints and silk vestments, a perfect metaphor for institutional religion's relationship with its own ideals. The earthquake is over, the tsunami has retreated, the fire will eventually burn out. But the questions it raised, about divine justice, natural evil, and whether Portugal should maybe consider building codes, those will burn for centuries. After all, Lisbon was one of Europe's most devout cities, destroyed on one of Christianity's holiest days during mandatory worship services. If that's not cosmic irony, it's at least cosmic poor timing. Progress is just the story we tell ourselves between disasters.
That concludes another Brutally Honest History Day. If you survived, reward yourself with a quick subscribe and share this misery with someone who thinks the past was simpler. I'll be back soon with fresh disasters. Until then, sleep tight and remember, history has worse plans for you than your alarm clock ever will.